I didn't stay silent because I was loyal. I stayed silent because, at the time, I didn't understand what silence was being used for. Most people believe that if something exists, there's a file for it, a form, a signature, a paper trail that leads somewhere solid. That belief is comforting. It keeps things orderly. It also isn't true. Some operations never touch paper. Some locations never appear on maps. And some things are handled in a way that makes sure no one, years later, can point to a line and say, "This is where it happened." I'm breaking that silence now, not because the rules changed, but because time did. Most of the men who stood next to me are dead. The rest learned to forget on purpose. I didn't. I just learned how to carry it quietly. My name is Richard J. Bennett. I served in the United States Air Force. I wasn't special. I wasn't high-ranking. I didn't have access to grand explanations or briefings that answered questions. I was the kind of man you assign to a task because you know he won't ask why it exists. He'll just do it. That was the requirement. Texas wasn't supposed to be memorable. Flat land, heat that never quite leaves your skin. A place people drive through, not toward. The site wasn't a base in the way civilians imagine a base. No sign, no runway you could spot on a commercial map. Just fences, distance, and a habit of never naming where you were, even casually. We were told it was a recovery operation. Not aircraft, not experimental hardware, just material. That word was used carefully. Material is neutral. It doesn't invite curiosity. The craft was already there when I arrived. I didn't see it come down. I didn't see it arrive. I saw it sitting under a temporary structure, open to the air, as if whoever placed it there wanted it accessible, not hidden. That alone should have told me something was wrong. It wasn't burned. It wasn't shattered. It wasn't twisted the way machines are when gravity wins. It looked handled, as if whatever brought it there understood exactly how fragile it was and exactly how much it mattered that it remain intact. We didn't photograph it, not officially. No cameras were issued, no logs were kept on site. If anything was documented, it happened later, somewhere else, by people who weren't there. My role was simple: assist in dismantling, piece by piece. No rush, no explanation. Each section removed, wrapped, labeled with codes that meant nothing to us, and moved out in unmarked transports that never returned. The material didn't behave the way metal should. It didn't resist tools the way hardened alloys do, and it didn't respond the way composites do either. It felt less like cutting and more like separating, as if the object expected to come apart under the right conditions. No one said the word extraterrestrial. No one needed to. When something doesn't match any reference point you've trained on, language becomes unnecessary. You just work slower. There were moments when the silence felt instructed, not incidental. Conversations died mid-sentence. Questions were answered with looks instead of words. We learned quickly that curiosity didn't get you removed from the operation. It got you reassigned, quietly, somewhere far less forgiving. What stayed with me wasn't fear. It was the realization that whatever we were handling wasn't meant to be understood by the people touching it. Understanding was someone else's job. We were there to make sure the object stopped being whole. At night, lying in quarters that didn't feel temporary enough, I kept thinking about how easily the craft had been reduced to parts, how something that clearly didn't belong in our world could be made unrecognizable so quickly, just by following orders. That's when it first occurred to me that secrecy isn't about hiding things from the public. It's about breaking them down until no one can point to the original shape and say, "This existed." And I still wonder, even now, whether dismantling the craft was the operation, or whether dismantling the witnesses was the real objective. What do you think stays classified longer, an object or the memory of the men who touched it? By the second week, the craft no longer looked like a craft. That was deliberate. We were instructed to avoid language that implied form or function. No one said wing, panel, or interior. Everything was a section. Everything was a unit. Words matter when you're trying not to remember what you're seeing. I learned early that procedures existed long before explanations did. You were shown how to do something before you were ever told what it was for. And if you asked too directly, the answer came back vague enough to be useless. Follow the sequence. Match the orientation marks. Don't force separation. Those were the rules. What struck me wasn't how advanced the object appeared. It was how unconcerned the supervisors were with us understanding it. That told me this wasn't about discovery. Discovery invites questions. This operation was about control. Some sections resisted removal, not with strength, but with something closer to indifference. Tools slipped. Pressure didn't translate the way physics says it should. Then suddenly the piece would release as if it had decided cooperation was no longer optional. No sparks, no tearing, just a quiet release. I remember one moment clearly. A curved segment, thin but rigid, lighter than it had any right to be. I held it longer than necessary before passing it on, not because I felt awe, because it felt finished. Purpose-built in a way nothing I'd worked on before ever had been. A supervisor noticed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten me. He simply said, "Put it down, Bennett." He didn't use my rank. That wasn't an accident. Later that day, we were reminded, casually, that medical evaluations were ongoing. Psychological fitness mattered. People who grew attached to anomalies didn't remain useful. That was the word they used. Attached. It became clear that the real protocol wasn't written anywhere. It lived in tone, in timing, in who spoke and who didn't. You learned fast that staying invisible was a skill. No one discussed where the sections were going. Trucks arrived at irregular hours. Drivers didn't linger. Containers were sealed and gone before dawn. If there was a destination, it wasn't shared with us. If there was a larger picture, we weren't meant to see it assembled. At night, some of us drank more than we should have. Others worked out until exhaustion shut their thoughts down. I chose silence. Silence was easier to manage than speculation. But memory doesn't obey orders. I began to notice inconsistencies, measurements that changed depending on how you looked at them, surfaces that reflected light differently when you weren't directly focused on them. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. The kind of thing you'd dismiss if you weren't already alert. I wrote none of it down. Not because I was afraid of being caught, but because I understood something by then. Anything recorded could be rewritten later. Anything remembered stayed dangerous. We weren't told what the craft was, but we were shown indirectly what it wasn't. It wasn't Russian. It wasn't Chinese. It wasn't experimental in the way governments experiment. And it wasn't ancient either. There was no decay, no improvisation, no redundancy you'd expect from human design. Everything felt intentional, minimal, exact. One evening, as we wrapped a final segment from that phase of dismantling, a technician near me whispered, barely audible, "This thing didn't crash." I didn't respond, not because I disagreed, because I knew that if I acknowledged the thought, it would stop being just his. From that point on, I understood the unspoken rule. You don't need to be told the truth to be shaped by it. Exposure alone does the work. And the deeper we went, the more it felt like the craft wasn't the only thing being taken apart. If something is dismantled carefully enough, at what point do you stop calling it destruction and start calling it erasure? By the time we reached what would have been called the interior, if that word still applied, I realized the operation had never been about learning how the craft worked. It was about making sure it never worked again. There were no seats, no consoles, nothing that suggested a pilot in the way we understand the word. That detail alone unsettled some of the men, though no one said it out loud. You don't need faces or bodies to feel absence. Sometimes absence is the loudest feature in a room. What we removed next didn't fit into containers designed for hardware. The shapes were wrong. The weight distribution made no sense. Balanced when suspended, unstable when resting. A few of us exchanged looks that carried more meaning than we wanted them to. This was the point where supervision tightened. New personnel appeared, men who didn't wear insignia and didn't introduce themselves. They didn't give orders often. They watched. When they did speak, it was usually to correct something before it became a problem. Not a mechanical problem, a human one. One of them pulled me aside after a shift. No threats, no lecture, just a quiet statement. You don't need to know what this is, Bennett. You only need to know what it isn't allowed to become. That sentence stayed with me longer than any briefing ever could. I began to understand that whatever this technology represented, it wasn't being hidden because it was dangerous in the usual sense. It was being hidden because it reframed things people aren't meant to question. Scale, authorship, ownership of the sky. There were components that reacted to proximity. Not activation, reaction. As if they were aware of being handled, but indifferent to us individually. That's hard to explain without sounding unsteady, so I'll say it this way. The craft didn't feel dead. It felt finished with its task. We were careful not to attribute intent. That was discouraged. But intent has a way of pressing itself into your thoughts when design outpaces explanation. No alarms went off. No defenses triggered. Nothing tried to stop us. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. Because it suggested that resistance was never anticipated. At some point, I asked a question I shouldn't have. Not directly. I asked how many similar operations had happened before. The answer came quickly. Too quickly. Enough. That was all. I noticed afterward that my assignments changed. Less contact with unfamiliar sections. More time spent on transport preparation and verification. Tasks that kept my hands busy and my mind occupied elsewhere. That's how systems respond to friction. They don't remove you immediately. They reduce your access. They soften your edges until you fit again. What troubled me most wasn't what we handled. It was what we were never shown. Certain areas were off limits entirely, covered, removed before we arrived. If this was dismantling, then we were only allowed to see the parts that wouldn't reshape us permanently. And yet, even that was enough. I stopped dreaming for a while. Then the dreams came back differently. Less imagery, more sensation. Weight. Distance. A sense of being observed without judgment. I never told medical. They weren't there to help us process what we'd seen. They were there to make sure we remained functional. When the operation wound down, there was no ceremony, no acknowledgement. We dispersed quietly, reassigned, scattered across units and time zones. The site returned to being nothing at all. But something had shifted, not in the world, in me. I realized then that secrecy isn't enforced by force. It's enforced by isolation. Once you know you're alone in a memory, you guard it instinctively. Not out of loyalty, but because sharing it would mean losing the only proof you have that it was real. And even now, decades later, I still hesitate when I try to picture the craft as a whole, because I'm no longer sure I remember it, or only the version that was left behind after we were done. If understanding was never the goal, what exactly were we protecting by making sure no one ever understood it? I left the Air Force without ceremony. No debrief that mattered, no final conversation that tied anything together. Just paperwork, handshakes, and the quiet understanding that whatever I had been part of was already sealed off from the version of history people are allowed to revisit. For a long time, I told myself that meant it was over. That was naive. The thing about dismantling something piece by piece is that you don't destroy its influence. You distribute it. You spread it across people, places, memories, and years. The object disappears, but the weight of it doesn't. It just stops having a name. I tried to live normally. Family, work, routine. The usual markers people use to prove to themselves that they belong to the world they came back to. And for the most part, it worked. Life has a way of covering things up with repetition. But certain moments never softened. Metal doesn't forget the hands that cut it. And men don't forget the moment they realize the rules they were taught don't cover everything. What stayed with me wasn't the shape of the craft. I couldn't draw it now, even if I tried. That was the point of dismantling it the way we did. No single person ever saw enough to reconstruct it honestly. What stayed was the procedure, the calm efficiency, the absence of urgency, the certainty that this had been done before and would be done again. That realization matters more than the object itself, because it tells you the truth isn't buried in one crash, one site, or one recovered artifact. It's embedded in a system that knows how to respond when something doesn't fit our story of ourselves. People ask why nothing ever leaks in a way that forces clarity, why no document settles it, why no photograph ends the debate. They're asking the wrong question. You don't keep a secret like this by locking it away. You keep it by breaking it into fragments so small that no one can prove what they're holding. I've thought often about the craft's apparent lack of damage, about how intact it was when we began taking it apart, about the quiet confidence implied by that condition. It didn't look like something that failed. It looked like something that arrived and was met. That possibility changes the meaning of everything we did afterward. If that craft wasn't an accident, if it wasn't lost or broken, then dismantling it wasn't recovery. It was response. And responses don't happen in isolation. They follow patterns. They follow precedent. I'm not telling this story to warn anyone. I don't have the authority for that. I'm not telling it to convince you either. Belief isn't required. It never was. I'm telling it because silence only works when everyone carrying it believes they're alone. I'm old enough now to know that isolation is the strongest tool any system has, stronger than classification, stronger than threat, stronger than fear. When you dismantle something carefully enough, what remains isn't debris. It's doubt. And doubt, once introduced, never goes back into storage. I don't know where the pieces ended up. I don't know who studied them. I don't know what conclusions were reached behind doors I was never allowed to approach. What I do know is this. Whatever was taken apart in that place in Texas, the last thing they made sure stayed intact was our silence. And the question I've lived with ever since is a simple one. If something needed to be erased so completely, what would have happened if it had been allowed to stay whole?